Welcome to the first episode of the Revulva. I'm your host, Saza Daniels, and today on the show we'll be talking about the political crackdown in Sudan. On the 3rd of June, the military, who have taken over after dictator Omar al-Bashir, killed 500 civilians in what is being dubbed the Sudan massacre. Women and children have been raped, killed, and thrown into the Nile River. Atrocious acts of murdering innocent Sudanese people has received little mainstream media attention, begging the question, how do we value innocent lives in our society? The Revulva seeks to address these senseless killings, show solidarity, and shed light on the Sudanese massacre. Joining us in studio today is Abul Ajak, who will be discussing what is really the underlying issue in Sudan. We'll be also streaming live on YouTube and Facebook to get your opinions and thoughts and messages, so please do send us questions and comments. For now, let's have a look at the footage of what is currently happening in Sudan. We urge sensitive viewers to be aware that the following footage might contain strong violence. Sudan is in the midst of a political crisis after security forces opened fire on pro-democracy protesters in the capital Khartoum. Representatives of the protesters have been in talks with the military over who would take control following the ousting of longtime President Omar al-Bashir. As you can see in the video, Sudan is going through harrowing times. My heart and my thoughts go out to all the affected families in Sudan. We are sending strength in these trying times. To our viewers at home and on social media, the Revulva seeks to address the political situation in Africa, taking a feminist lens into African politics. Today we have Abul Ajak joining us to discuss the underlying issues during the Sudan massacre. Please note that Abul is from South Sudan and not necessarily North Sudan, but she will explain more about the political context there. Abu, thank you so much for coming out and having a chat with us. Welcome to the Revulva.
Thank you for having me.
So, to our viewers at home who just want to get an idea of your involvement, and I know we discussed this at length before, what is your involvement, or how do you see the Sudanese massacre affecting you in your personal life?
I think this is a repetition of the history of Sudan. Like for the past 50 years, Sudan is like massacres and death is not new to Sudan. The Sudanese government has committed various atrocities in Darfur, in South Sudan, and it's been known for being very oppressive, for being very suppressive. So this is not something that is necessarily new. It's definitely newer to Khartoum. They have had protests where in the past, like in 2012, in 2011, where the government has definitely reacted with a lot of violence, with unnecessary amount of violence towards civilians, innocent civilians. So I think the current awareness that we're having towards the issue is a lot newer than the fact that the Sudanese government and the Sudanese military has been committing atrocities. I think that's essentially part of the, yeah.
Can you give us a political overlay of what's happening? I know North Sudan and South Sudan have succeeded each other as countries. Can you give us a bit of a perspective on who exactly compromises of Sudan and who is in South Sudan, and why Omar al-Bashir has been affecting both of these states?
So Omar al-Bashir came into power through a military coup in the 1980s, and before him there was a military president who incited the Sharia law into Sudan, and Sudan is essentially, there's two different religions, mainly two main religions. Like in the north it's mainly Muslim, and they're also of Arabic descent. In the south they're mainly Christians of Black African descent. In Darfur and in the Nuba Mountains there are Black Africans who are also Muslim. So and the way Sudan was categorized for a very long time was Arab and Muslim is a first-class citizen. You have access to all the resources. Black and Muslim is not necessarily a you still will face a lot of discrimination within the country. Black and Christian, or Black and maybe African traditional religion, you are barely someone to be recognized. And this narrative was actually very visible even in the news. And also the imposition of Sharia law was meant to affect the whole of Sudan, even people and citizens of Sudan who were not necessarily Islamic. And this obviously caused a lot of tensions within the Sudanese people, the Sudanese community.
So I think it was people from Eritrea were telling me a bit about the situation from their perspective. And I think the opinion is that it is a wealth-based society. Sudan has a lot of wealth. And because it has a lot of wealth, dividing this wealth between these different classes of people who are discriminating against each other is also what's causing conflict. I see you talk a bit also about Sharia law. Do you think having a religious government in place is something that affects African countries positively or negatively?
I think the religion is not maybe part of the current conflict. That was part of like a previous conflicts. I can, to some aspects, it could be, but it's more like the way the conflict started recently was actually definitely economic. The prices of bread rose, the prices of fuel rose, and life became very difficult for people on the ground. And also, this wasn't handled properly by the government, and also with the issues with the oil between the north and the south, there's a lot of conflict over oil territory and over oil wealth. So yeah, economic issues definitely come into play in a very, very large way, and I think that could have been in many ways a final straw for people. Like if you can't feed your families, if you can't really live a life that's, you can sustain yourself, obviously, we also have a government that suppresses you. Obviously, I think one of the things that really came out when Bashir's house was raided was the millions of dollars found lying in his house. So you do have all these economic issues that come into play where people's frustrations have always been at this level that they couldn't control. And yeah, they've been protesting since December. This is a very long time for people to protest. Like, it's a very long time for people to stay in the streets, but they realize that there's no way we are going to have any peace in Sudan if Bashir or the military is leading. Their demands are for a civilian government. And a lot of the economic changes, I don't know what that will exactly entail, but they're very necessary. Like, and also like some of the economic problems are caused by sanctions towards Bashir, for example, and certain things.
The ICC sanctions, for example. So for our viewers who don't know, Omar al-Bashir is a dictator who was tried in the International Criminal Court in Hague regarding his war crimes committed in Sudan. In terms of Omar al-Bashir and the wealth of the society and the economic policies of the society, do you see a pro-democracy movement really changing the economic situation there? Or do you think that the economic situation is kind of detached from those politics because of what's happening with the brute force of the military?
I don't think it's detached at all. I do think democracy will change a lot of things. I wouldn't know how. But I definitely think that it would, like with the military government and with the, economically it would open up the world to Sudan. It would open up the world to Sudan a lot because, all the sanctions would probably, if you have a peaceful government that respects human rights, that respects the civilians in the country, why would anyone want to have sanctions against such a government? And this would definitely open up trade agreements and would open up the country. However, I think also it's very hard to determine how that would happen because it would take a very, very, very long time, and there's a lot within the system that has to be repaired as of the moment, and it's not something that we could easily predict happening the way we want it to.
And I think a lot of people are hoping after that pro-democracy move that people have made, the civilians in Sudan have made, that this kind of transition would be an easy transition out of the dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir, but the military is getting in the way. So yes, it's not going to be an easy road for those in Sudan. I do, however, think when we do look at democracy and economic issues in tandem and opening up borders, I worry about our unilateral governments and our peacemaking governments and how much effect they do have on such a culturally divided country like Sudan and other places in Africa. I find after colonization, a lot of the borders created don't really define the ethnic groups and the cultural groups that are within those spaces and in those countries. So I question whether it is a cohesion of Sudan going towards a democracy or whether it's a matter of cultural groups taking the economy into their own hands. But as you can see, that has caused conflict in itself. We see women leading a lot of this revolution, or at least that's the way it's being portrayed in media. What are your opinions on that?
I think that's very important. I think it's very, very necessary. I think there's a perception usually with is a country like Sudan where it's a Muslim country, and women do wear veils most of the time, not completely, but they do cover their hair. And there's a perception that women aren't necessarily empowered. However, in Sudan, they are quite empowered. Obviously, there's still very huge cultural issues that we have to work on, but empowerment is possible for women. And I feel like for women to actually lead the revolution, to actually stand up, they're a very big part of the revolution. They've been fighting for women's rights, and it's happening in tandem with women's rights. And also, it's happening in tandem with people kind of being open-minded to what Sudan actually entails, what the reality of Sudan has been for a long time. So I do think that that women's rights are a very big part of this revolution, and women's empowerment is a very big part of the current revolution taking place.
And I wonder, I wonder if Sharia law is the thing that has exacerbated or the issue with women, and women are taking a step outside of the constraints of the Muslim traditions and cultures in order to bring their voice out. But yeah, it's inspiring to watch women lead a revolution in Africa, because we don't hear about revolutions being headlined these ways. But as African women, we know we are the backbones of the revolution, the administration of most of the things that have happened in Africa. I know that you've been personally affected by the conflicts that have happened in South Sudan. Do you want to speak a bit more about that and maybe your family members that might have been affected?
For a country like South Sudan, peace was a very, I was kind of born knowing that there's war. And I was born in Sudan. I actually wasn't born as a South Sudanese. When I was born, we were Sudan. So the separation was also quite a new thing, kind of having this conflicting identities kind of pop up suddenly in my teens, like, oh yeah, now I'm South Sudanese. But this is an experience that we've become very used to. And even, there's a lot of, I think, cross-generational trauma. There's a lot of, it's just a constant experience of war that people have had to experience. So I do think that even with the North, there's a lot of complicated politics that definitely happens.
It is complicated, yes.
We did sign a peace deal in the South. The South also had its own conflict starting in 2013 within South Sudan. And the North, under Bashir's government, was responsible for, not responsible entirely, but were contributing towards a peace deal that was signed. And soon after that peace deal was signed,
things went back to the exact same way they are.
Yes.
As you can see, a lot of the times, a lot of these peace deals, a lot of these pro-democratic movements are just laden with complications as an African continent. And I think it's important to bring awareness and solutions. Looking at the economic solutions specifically within Africa, I think is important. I tend to question whether governments need to be involved in these economic solutions, but definitely looking at how we are managing our wealth as an African continent is a huge step towards a brighter future for Africa. Thank you for joining us, guests, and please let us know on Facebook if you have any comments or questions that you would like to pose to our guest today. We are talking on the Sudan crisis, looking specifically at an African feminist perspective on the crisis. So send us any questions and please join us again for the next segment. We have a Facebook question from one of our viewers. The Facebook question is asking, why are people using blue on their Instagram profiles? Is it a trend or are we actually changing things? We're going to get some comments from our guest today regarding the issue. So as you can see, people are changing their profile pictures to blue on Instagram in order to show solidarity for the issue. Do you think that this is a worthy solution to the problem?
I wouldn't necessarily call it a solution, but I would call it a very strong sign of solidarity. I would call it like a very strong creation, it definitely creates awareness for the issue, and any sort of awareness is important. That doesn't necessarily translate into any political action taking place, unfortunately. I'm still waiting for the international community, for example, to kind of step in and kind of have more, kind of create this need for peace. As of yet, I think it's only Ethiopia where the Sudanese government and the military government and the civilian transitional committee, are going to have meetings, and the Ethiopian government has been trying to kind of create that
a mediation
Yeah.
sort of space for it.
Yeah,
And it's
and
very
push it.
interesting because, you know, China and Russia have been known to support Alma al-Bashir with weaponry, and the US has been known to support, I think it's South Sudan, with aid in certain sectors. I always find it interesting that Cold War issues play out in proxy situations in African continents, and often we don't know how these things are instigated. So the international community kind of plays a double-edged sword role. Yes, we want help from them in order to create peace, but we also know that they exacerbate issues with their intervention.
Exactly, and we're desperate as well, so we don't really know how or what, you know, like people don't really know how this will pan out because of the desperation and, you know, with like the UN leaving Sudan simply because of the insecurity is very reminiscent of what happened in Rwanda in 1994. So
Exactly.
there's all these questions that come into place that are we, you know, what kind of help do we actually need? Like, and will it actually mean that we're going to be in a better position or in a worse off position whose interests will be served based on the kind of help that Sudan gets? So it's a very, very unfortunate and complex.
It's an unfortunate place to be, but it's a good question to ask. You know, how are we solving our issues and how are we getting involved with the international community? I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Abul,
Thank you.
and lending your opinion to the conversation. I think it's important to note how the international community gets involved in these conflicts, and also as a continent, how we are supporting these conflicts. It's surprising that Ethiopia will initiate mediations, but South Africa really has said nothing regarding the Sudanese massacre. So we implore our government also to try and create space in order for this continent to rise to the future. Thank you so much for joining us today on The Revulva. We are an African feminist talk show that focuses mostly on African politics within our land of Azania. So today we've been speaking on the Sudan crisis, and you know, we'd love to hear your opinion, so please follow us on Facebook and follow us on YouTube under UCT TV. And thank you for joining us today.
You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, log on, and zone out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Molly, E, Crank, Oxy, or skip out the hard lemonade during commercials because the revolution will not be televised.